What makes things true is not their material existence, but how well they cohere in your experience of the world, and the way they take on a life in your mind when you look clearly. This is the insight that most sophisticated discourse about fantasy misses. Fairy tales are often viewed pejoratively as escapism, a retreat into comfortable unreality. Really, they are a return to a kind of reality that the modern world has evacuated, where pattern and story organise experience into something a little easier to navigate. The disenchanted world is not more real than the enchanted one. It's less real in the way that matters most, in which real means inhabitable, and we can live in body and soul, reason and imagination, together. This video is about something we don't have a name for in English. The Portuguese call it saudade, meaning a sense of longing for something lost, or something which never existed in the first place, at least not in the way you imagine it. The Welsh call it hiraeth, homesickness for a home you can't return to, or that perhaps never was. The Japanese have mono no arare, the bittersweet awareness of impermanence, and the ache that comes from the beauty of things we can't hold on to. All of our oldest cultures have a name for this feeling, which suggests it's one of the most persistent and ingrained universal features of the human emotional landscape. We are a species that misses things, and we are increasingly a species that misses things that never existed. Over time, and with a thoroughness that's hard to ignore, something has been happening to us, and I want to understand why. It's become increasingly common for people to spend as many hours as they can immersed in video games, fantasy novels, and animated films, mourning the loss of an enchanted relationship with reality that most of them never actually had. What I'm describing is the nebulous grief you feel while watching a Studio Ghibli movie, or reading Tolkien or Murakami or Ishiguro. Spend enough time in these worlds, and you'll discover a kind of experience that is best described as uncanny, yet comforting. They provide a way of relating to the real world that your own life can't, and that grief is the difference between them. They don't make you nostalgic for a memory or a golden era, but for a way of being in the world that the present day seems to have misplaced. This essay is the first part of a two-part series about why you should listen to that grief, and what it's pointing at, and what, if anything, literature and myth can do about it. In this video, we'll work through the philosophical and historical background, what disenchantment is and how it happened, what nostalgia is and what it's telling us, what fairy tales and myths are actually for, and why the worlds that Studio Ghibli, Murakami and Ishiguro construct have the emotive power they have. In the second part, we'll go deep into Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, exploring its deeper theological roots, and journeying through an imagined world so internally true and so deeply grounded in the oldest stories of Western civilization that its power to move people feels almost more magical than the books themselves. Tolkien understood better than most why we miss worlds that never existed. But first, the ache itself. Where does it come from? And what is it trying to tell us? The word disenchantment was given its modern philosophical meaning by the German sociologist Max Weber, who borrowed it from Friedrich Schiller. Weber used it to describe the cultural transition in which the old world, animate, meaningful, and charged with spiritual significance, was replaced by a mechanical one, governed by discoverable natural laws, and deprived of the gods and spirits that made their homes in every mountain, river, and thunderclap. In Weber's words, the new world is demystified, and has no feeling of being imbued with sacred presence. The old gods are dead, and the universe has been reduced to a system of causes and effects, where power is the ultimate source of meaning. For most of human history, we were nestled inside a cosmos that had our best interests at heart, and we could be playful without the poison of a cynicism that arises when we find ourselves floating in a void of dead matter without a map. This is no minor adjustment. It's the single most significant shift in the relationship between human beings and their experience of reality that has occurred in recorded history. And by historical standards, it happened only yesterday. Most people think of the medieval cosmos as a different and more primitive, scientific model than the one we have today. But C.S. Lewis described it as a totally different experience of being in the world. In The Discarded Image, he wrote, "The model is not simply a theory about how the universe is built or how it works. It is also a spiritual and imaginative expression of man's whole situation. When the medieval peasant looked up at the night sky, they didn't just see empty space scattered with burning rocks. They saw a structured, hierarchical, intelligible cosmos, one that was full to the brim with a tangible atmosphere of meaning and intention, and whispered of an ordered presence of intelligence from its centre to its circumference. The stars were moved by intelligences, and the planets governed aspects of human character. Every natural phenomenon was a participating node in a network of correspondence and significance that reached from the lowest stone to the highest heaven. You lived inside a story, and the story was about you. Lewis cuts no corners when explaining the phenomenological quality of this experience, emphasizing what it actually felt like to inhabit the medieval cosmos from the inside. Its fullness was something that worked its way into your heart, and that you lived by. Standing under the sky at night, you didn't know what the stars were made of or how they moved, but you could feel their aliveness and the intelligence that governed the whole system. The stars were free to be interpreted, to make patterns and produce a kind of music as they turned. You couldn't hear it, but you could see it in the weaving of the fundamental harmonic of all existence, the underlying order on which your whole experience on Earth rests. When you look up at the sky today, it's not immediately mysterious. Any wonder you feel has to breathe through your knowledge of the cold facts of the scientific phenomena. But if you give it some patience, the night sky will offer you some inarticulate sense of enormity, of significance, of being addressed by something immense. As Lewis suggests, this is the residue of the medieval experience. The model that generated it is long gone, but still, the feeling persists. The first task of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment was to dismantle the story of the old cosmos from the outside in. They were working towards a goal they couldn't see, let alone name, without malice or any intention to leave us feeling purposeless and uprooted. Their method was the progressive replacement of participation with observation. The substitution of the detached, measuring, hypothesis-testing scientific gaze for the embedded, responsive, meaningful engagement with a world that spoke back. In his book, A Secular Age, Charles Taylor identifies this as the transition from a porous self to a buffered self. The porous self is one whose boundaries are permeable to the outside world. Spirits, moods from the landscape, and the sacred presence of a beautiful place can all find a way in, without you having to lower your guard. The buffered self, on the other hand, is enclosed and defended, operating behind a kind of inner glass screen that separates it from any direct contact with the forces that we once understood as real. The modern world has made buffered selves of all of us. We know intellectually that a storm is a meteorological event, but we don't feel it as the expression of something that has something to do with us. The consequences of this are not only intellectual. They're psychological, which most of us realize, and spiritual, which many of us don't. Lewis describes what we lost. The great change which the rise of the modern scientific picture of the universe brought about was not the substitution of a worse or a better picture, but the substitution of a picture for something quite different, for a participation in a cosmos. As we systematized the universe, we also changed our relationship to it. We moved from inside to outside. This is the root of the ache. It's not a nostalgia for the content of medieval cosmology, or the propositional beliefs of an earlier time. We are willing to do away with Ptolemaic astronomy and the literal existence of the four humors. It's a nostalgia for a relationship to the cosmos in which we are securely attached, for the feeling of being inside a story rather than outside it. If we're in the story, at best we can hope for a happy ending, and at worst we will find some magic along the way, the kind of magic that feels like divine love. Humans have a deep spiritual need to feel that we matter, not just to other humans, but to the universe itself. One that is charged, as Gerard Manley Hopkins put it, with the grandeur of God. This is where Tolkien's formulation becomes essential. In On Fairy Stories, he distinguishes between the primary world, the physical world of matter and causation, and the secondary world, the world that the story maker builds, which operates according to its own internal logic, and which could be entered by the imagination and really experienced, if only we have a little faith. What really happens, Tolkien writes, is that the story maker proves a successful sub-creator. He makes a secondary world in which your mind can enter. Inside it, what he relates is true. It accords with the laws of that world. You therefore believe it while you are, as it were, inside. The secondary world is not physically present, but it's still real and still alive. It's a realness that comes from being internally coherent, internally truthful, inhabitable by reason and imagination together. By this account, a good fantasy is a truer one, because it's grounded in reason. And reason, the mechanism by which we judge reality, is not grounded in the physical. It operates in the domain of the abstract, the universal, and the invisible. What makes things true is not their material existence, but how well they cohere in your experience of the world, and the way they take on a life in your mind when you look clearly. Love, for example, can't be touched or measured, but you feel it more powerfully than anything else, and it will change how you act. We sacrifice for our loved ones, and we are often inspired by it to change the world, to make it better, to help the intangible break through into the physical. This is the insight that most sophisticated discourse about fantasy misses. Fairy tales are often viewed pejoratively as escapism, a retreat into comfortable unreality. Really, they are a return to a kind of reality that the modern world has evacuated, where pattern and story organise experience into something a little easier to navigate. The disenchanted world is not more real than the enchanted one. It's less real in the way that matters most, in which real means inhabitable, and we can live in body and soul, reason and imagination, together. In 2001, the cultural theorist Svetlana Boym published The Future of Nostalgia. It was an important book then, but it's even more important now, since it's about a feeling that has been steadily growing in our cultural atmosphere. Boym opens with the observation that the way we characterise nostalgia has changed. It was once classified as a medical condition, a soldier's illness, or the disease of the displaced person who can't stop longing for home. In modernity, it has become something closer to a collective condition. It's no longer the pathology of the individual, but the background hum of the culture at large. Boym distinguished between two kinds of nostalgia that she called restorative and reflective. Restorative nostalgia, she argued, is the dangerous kind. It wants to roll back the clock, sometimes taking the longing seriously as a political program. It builds monuments, nativist movements, and national myths designed to recreate a golden age that only ever existed as a projection of present anxieties onto the past. This is the nostalgia of the demagogue, and it manifests as flags, slogans, and the demand to make something great again. Boym notes that restorative nostalgia will never acknowledge itself, because it would have to admit its own defensiveness. It presents itself as a simple desire to recover what was taken. Reflective nostalgia is markedly different. It dwells in longing and loss, Boym writes, and it resists the temptation to resolve that longing into a plan. She writes that it's a longing for a different time, the time of our childhood, the slower rhythms of our dreams. It acknowledges that the object of longing is partly constructed and partly imagined, and partly a projection of our own needs, understanding that memory fades and that humans have a tendency to idealize. In reflective nostalgia, the ache is the whole point, because it gives us a window to see through to identify what's missing in the present. Boym identifies a quality she calls the double exposure of two images, of home and abroad, of past and present, of dream and everyday life, that characterizes the most self-aware forms of nostalgia. Rather than wanting to escape the present and return to a romanticized past, the nostalgic wants to understand what the longing is for. This distinction is crucial for understanding why so many people feel this kind of grief, the longing for worlds that never existed, but can't pinpoint exactly what's missing. It's not a restorative feeling. When we watch a Ghibli film, we cry. When we read Norwegian Wood, we feel an eerie absence which paradoxically makes us feel at home. But we're not under the illusion that we once lived in a world of forest spirits, enchanted bathhouses, and wandering sentient scarecrows. The grief is reflective. It helps us see through the system and experience another world, without claiming to be a memory of something real. Nostalgia is an arrow that points us to the experience of a world that was full, as Weber identified, Lewis described, and Tolkien mourned. It's a world that didn't necessarily exist in history, or at least not in the way that we long for it today. But the feeling that such a world has something to do with you. The world we miss is the story that holds us, and the universe that feels alive with caring. This is what Boym's reflective nostalgic is searching for, without being able to put a finger on exactly what it is, since our disenchanted, secular world has forgotten the words for it. We have to learn the language anew, through fairy tales, myth, and fantasy, because those are the forms that kept it alive when the old cosmological framework was dismantled. Boym also offers an account of how modern nostalgia is connected to the way we experience time in the modern world. She notes that traditional societies experience time as cyclical. Seasons return in perpetuity, the social life is organised around the same feast days each year, and the patterns of the cosmos generated a stable relationship with us. Modernity has rebuilt time on the schedule and the clock. It's linear, which leaves no room for the cyclical, and it produces what Boym called the longing for continuity in a fragmented world. We miss the experience of time as meaningful, ordered patterns, and how we are contained in its story. In other words, we miss kairos, the significant qualitative time that modernity has largely replaced with chronos, the quantitative, manageable time that helps us hit KPIs and draft our quarterly earnings reports. The replacement signals a shift in perceived power, as we have become lords over time and bent it to our will. But kairos will always be the domain of the cosmos, and we feel its pull even when we have disconnected from it, because its power dwarfs ours. Here, nostalgia and the fairy tale converge, because fairy tales unfold entirely in kairos. As Tolkien observes, they don't have technology in them. They have lightning, but not an electric lamp, fire, but not a furnace. They have magic, but not a machine. And herein lies their wisdom. Technology, by its nature, is associated with chronos time, with progress, accumulation of resources, and measurable improvement of output. The things that appear in fairy tales are the permanent things, like love and death, courage and betrayal, the forest, the river, and the fire, the witch, the hero, and the guide. None of these things are subject to change with the technology of a new generation. They're part of the eternal human experience, the oldest parts of us and our world that have always been with us and always will be with us, in whatever form the present takes. When we miss worlds that never existed, this is what we're really missing. It's an experience of the world that is just for itself, organised around permanent things that we can relate to, rather than abstractions we have to improve. We are missing the feeling of being inside a story whose deepest elements are stable, and whose rules don't change when the next technological cycle arrives. The American blogger Scott Alexander, in his essay Meditations on Moloch, recovered a figure from the ancient world that defines the quintessentially modern form of destruction. Worship of Moloch peaked during the Iron Age, and the Canaanites sacrificed their children to the god of insatiable appetite. This wasn't a balanced relationship. Moloch demands what you value the most and promises great reward, but never keeps his promise and always sells you short. Alexander uses Moloch as the name for a dynamic that he identifies as the engine of coordination failures in modern civilization. The logic of the system itself creates a negative-sum game in which all participants are made worse off. What makes this particularly treacherous is that there's no single agent you can blame, because every individual is just responding to the incentives in front of them. Moloch is an emergent systems dynamic which has no one's best interests at heart. In 1947, Tolkien was telling us about something very similar. In On Fairy Stories, he wrote, "It is indeed an age of improved means to deteriorated ends. It is part of the essential malady of such days, producing the desire to escape, not indeed from life, but from our present time and self-made misery, that we are acutely conscious both of the ugliness of our works and of their evil. The ugliness and evil don't need any bad people to propagate them. They are designed by the system itself, products of the economy, culture, and way of organising time and attention. The outcomes they produce are undesirable for almost everyone, if not everyone. The means have improved beyond any historical precedent, with technological development allowing people to coordinate at a scale never seen before. But the ends have deteriorated in ways that are just as new and just as frightening. This dynamic is so ingrained in our global culture that it's impossible for anyone to escape its grasp. It's hard to find Moloch at the individual level because he looks like a reasonable trade, giving up something small in exchange for a quantifiable benefit. When you give up a little attention for a hit of dopamine, or a little slowness for an end-of-year bonus, it doesn't feel like an encounter with an evil god. But trading the letter for the email for the text for the notification, that human part of you which needs genuine connection slowly degrades. It's a death by 1,000 cuts. You trade the walk through the neighbourhood for the commute by car, the commute for the remote meeting, and each efficiency seems obvious until you find yourself lonely, addicted, or deeply unhappy. Moloch erodes the web of physical rootedness that grounds you in your own life. You trade the Sundays of rest for the continuous availability of everything, which is also the continuous experience of nothing being special. Moloch is the god of the improved means to deteriorated ends. The sacrifice he demands is barely noticeable because it's not dramatic. It builds incrementally, in the 10,000 small trades that each seem rational, but that together produce a world that nobody wanted. One that is more convenient and more informed, but profoundly emptier and less human than the one it replaced. This nostalgia is distinctively rational. None of us want to return to a world without anesthetic or without the internet, but we are longing for something that was really traded away. The imagined worlds that we find ourselves drawn to, in the fairy tale, the Ghibli film, the Tolkien forest, and the Murakami night, help us see what it was. I'm talking about enchantment. Not magic in the sense of supernatural phenomena, but the feeling of being in a world that is really made for us. Enchantment is how it feels to live a life full of meaning, where you're inside the story rather than outside it. The disenchanted world has played a long trick on us, convincing us that it's more extraordinary with its quantum physics and computation. In a way, these things are stranger than any fairy tale. but they're only abstractions. We can't take part, we can only manipulate. The abstract world can't be experienced as meaningful, only understood as strange. And this is the exact function of what Tolkien calls the secondary world. When done well, with the inner consistency of reality that Tolkien demands, the fairy tale and the fantasy create a space where you can remember what it feels like to be enchanted. There's a safe place for your soul to land and learn to play again, without the glass screen of abstraction and theorization. Temporarily, they allow you to meaningfully participate in the world again. And that's why I think they're some of the most popular and important art forms of today. Three artists dominate the landscape of nostalgia in the contemporary imagination. We'll look at each one because they all represent a distinct strategy for making the ache bearable. Hayao Miyazaki and Studio Ghibli operate in the oldest fairy tale tradition, in alignment with Tolkien's description of the secondary world, and carefully constructing their own with the internally consistent logic that he described. Ghibli films are often praised for their fantastic animation, distinct style, and visual beauty, but what differentiates them from other animated fantasies is their relationship with the natural world. Whether it's the forest, the wind, or the bathing house on the border between the human and spirit worlds, the natural world comes alive in every Ghibli film in a way that our modern experience of it is not. The trees don't fade into the background, and the wind has intention. The spirits aren't supernatural characters cut and pasted into a world that resembles our own, but they are the life and depth of the natural world made visible. This is the same quality of experience that Vapor described as lost in The Disenchantment. The sense of a natural world that is alive with significance, breathes presence, and shows you that it cares about you, because you're part of the story too. When Chihiro walks into the spirit world in Spirited Away, the place she ends up is different, but it's not an alternate universe. She has crossed into a deeper layer of the world she already lives in, like she's taken off a pair of dirty glasses, and she's seeing clearly for the first time. The spirit world is the ordinary world experienced from much deeper inside. It's how the primary world would feel if the buffer of disenchantment had been removed. Just as C.S. Lewis described the medieval cosmos as something imminently present, that had a stake in people's lives, Ghibli films bring the magic of the heavens to the ground, where we can live inside it, play amongst it, and let it make us wiser. They reconstruct this experience for a modern audience that had lost the original cosmological framework, but still feels the pull of its tides. They can't restore the medieval cosmos, but they can restore how it feels to live with that sense of wonder, that feeling of being in communion with the natural world. What Murakami does is different, and it asks more of his audience. Where Miyazaki builds a secondary world that is visually complete and internally consistent, Murakami weaves the secondary world into the primary one, leaving us to untangle them. The well that Toru Okada descends in the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, the underground library where Kafka lives in Kafka on the Shore, and the town that comes to Sakura Tazaki in his sleep are where the boundary between the two worlds starts to blur. An unfamiliar order of reality breaks into the ordinary, and we glimpse a secondary world through the primary, left to wonder whether the primary world was ever as closed as it appeared. Philosophically, Murakami's strategy is closer to the Romantic tradition than to the fairy tale tradition. The Romantic poets, like Wordsworth, Keats, and Coleridge, were also responding to disenchantment, aiming to recover the participatory relationship with nature and cosmos that the Enlightenment had displaced. But where the medieval world had a complete cosmological framework for the sacred, the Romantics had only the individual imagination, reaching towards something they had lost the words to describe. The intensity of the ache that Murakami's characters feel is decidedly romantic. For them, the ordinary world is banal and insufficient, and they live with a perpetual awareness of a threshold they want to cross but can't. They recognize the sacred and they feel it calling to them, but they don't know how to answer. His novels are structured around this awareness, around the sense that something immense and important is just on the other side of the ordinary, if only they could access it. It comes to them in dreams, in certain kinds of music, and in the silent hours just before dawn, but they never quite manage to reach it in waking life. Ishiguro takes yet another angle, and it's the most painful. His secondary world is the past, as imagined by people who were wrong about it. In The Remains of the Day, Stevens the butler has organised his entire life around a model of loyal service to a great household that turns out to have been complicit in the worst evils of the century. In Never Let Me Go, the characters have been raised within the bounds of an idyllic English boarding school, among rolling hills and modest ambitions. Gradually, they discover those bounds were designed to conceal the horror of what they really are. In The Buried Giant, a post-Arthurian England is sustained in a kind of enchanted forgetting, where peace is preserved behind the fog of a collective amnesia so insidious that the past, and what's really been happening, is under threat. Ishiguro is tapping into something that neither Miyazaki nor Murakami does. He's using the enchantment of the secondary world to interrogate the comfort we feel there. The worlds his characters are nostalgic for depend upon a veil of ignorance. If they pay attention in the right places, while pretending the wrong ones are invisible, they can live in the world enchanted. But if they notice something they shouldn't, the constructed beauty shatters, and the ugliness of the primary world breaks through. The enchantment was real, but it cost them freedom. When Stevens is driving through the English countryside, and he realizes for the first time what he has given his life to, it devastates him. When Kathy, Tommy, and Ruth discover the secret at Hailsham, their memories of their childhood are permanently desecrated. What they're all feeling is grief, and it comes from something Boehm calls the double exposure. Two images at once, both true, neither capable of cancelling the other. Together, these three artists triangulate on the contemporary longing. Miyazaki shows us what the enchanted world would look like and feel like if we could really live there. Murakami shows us where to find the boundary between the magical and the ordinary, and why we will never reach it. And Ishiguro warns us of the danger of that longing, and what awaits us if we try too hard to escape the world we live in right now. He shows us that the comfort of the enchanted world can be complicit in what it refuses to see. From different angles, they're all responding to the same fact, that the disenchanted world will never be enough, and that it's not your fault. It's not the result of any individual failure or a broken imagination. It's structural, produced by the historical process that Weber and Tolkien both talked about, and that Moloch feeds. We're almost at the end of the video, and if you've watched this far, you probably intuitively understand the appeal of nostalgic worlds. But it's time to address the elephant in the room. What's the point? The world is what it is, and the enchantment isn't physically real. The spirits in the forest are not there in real life. The secondary world, however internally consistent, isn't the same as the primary world. Why cultivate a grief for something that never was? To find an answer to this, we need to go back to Tolkien, who spent his whole life trying to understand fairy tales. He writes that fantasy is a natural human activity. It certainly does not destroy or even insult reason, and it does not either blunt the appetite for, nor obscure the perception of, scientific verity. On the contrary, the keener and the clearer is the reason, the better fantasy will it make. This is a counterintuitive claim. We tend to think that the more rigorously rational our minds are, the less susceptible we should be to fantasy. But Tolkien thought the opposite, that rigor and reason are aids to real fantasy. They work in collaboration because they're both engaged in the same overarching project of understanding what is real. The key to this is the concept of subcreation. Tolkien understood the human capacity for creative imagination as enchanted in itself, and that in making secondary worlds, we are participating in the divine creative act. The Bible opens with, "In the beginning, God created," and the human being, made in the image of God, is creative by definition. Tolkien writes in his poem Mythiopia, "We make still by the law in which we're made." When a storyteller builds a secondary world, there's something more important going on than pure escapism. They're exercising the power that is at the same time distinctively human and distinctively enchanted. They add to the world, create new experiences that weren't previously available, and bring new beings to life with their words alone. And their main tool as creators and enchanters is reason. The two together, reason, imagination, logic, and story, constitute the full human instrument of understanding. Over time, our culture has severed them, assigning reason to science and imagination to entertainment, and this has produced a new way of living in reality, a divided one that divides us too. We live in exactly the world that the disenchantment diagnosis describes. Tolkien argues that the gods themselves derive their dignity from the human world below. In On Fairy Stories, he writes, "The gods may derive their colour and beauty from the high splendours of nature, but it was man who obtained these for them, abstracted them from sun and moon and cloud. Their personality they get direct from him. The shadow or flicker of divinity that is upon them they receive through him from the invisible world, the supernatural." There's much more here than a primitive misunderstanding of natural phenomena. The divine myth is a real perception of nature's face, when we can look upon it without modern abstractions. It's personalised, and it tells us a story in a form we can understand with our whole bodies, rather than just with our words and our heads. This is the insight that the rationalist critique of myth always misses. Myths aren't failed science. They are successful phenomenology, accounting for everything science can't measure, but that experience correctly insists is there. A good myth, a true myth, is more accurate than science in its depth, and in the gifts it can provide us with. This is what's really going on with the fairy tale and the myth, and it's how to answer the charge of escapism. When you create a secondary world, or inhabit one temporarily, you're not retreating. You're learning about the dimensions that won't fit into the disenchanted world, and about how to have a richer experience of it. As Tolkien told us, fairy tales are the oldest and most fundamental form of human activity that involves reason and imagination in equal parts. In other words, they're the original form of what it means to be human, and they teach us how to see what's real. In every culture, myths function as coded narratives which encapsulate the permanent grammar of the human experience in its full complexity. Some things don't change with new technology, and were as true 30,000 years ago as they are now. Love and death, the hero and the monster, the descent into darkness and the return to the light, the brotherhood that survives the wilderness, and the guide who appears just when things are getting too tough to handle alone. There's a reason these narratives are found in ancient traditions across the world, and there's a reason why we respond to them. They're not arbitrary conventions, because they reveal the underlying relationship between us and the cosmos, as long as we're willing to look. Fairy tales, myths, and great fantasy novels move us in ways that the most accomplished realistic fiction often doesn't. And as Tolkien put it, that's because they're truer. They reach deeper, cutting through the surface to engage with more than just our heads. This is also why fairy tales, as Tolkien notes, contain no technology. They have lightning, but not an electric lamp. They have fire, but not a furnace. They have magic, but not a machine. The machine belongs to the chronos of quantifiable output, and the measurable advancement from one state to a better one. But magic belongs to something else entirely. It's what we find when we participate, through our will and our imagination, in a world that is alive enough to respond. In other words, it's how the fairy tale encodes everything that's real, so we find our porous selves in relationship with the cosmos that welcomes us to it. When we read a fairy tale and feel the rightness of the magic, there is no factual error about the laws of nature. In the logic of the secondary world, we are recognizing something real, but that the primary world is kept hidden in our daily lives. Tolkien writes of what he calls eucatastrophe, the sudden, unexpected turn towards grace at the moment of deepest despair, the good catastrophe that arrives when all seems lost. In his view, this is the fundamental narrative moment of myth, and it corresponds to the deepest structure of the Christian story. The resurrection is the ultimate eucatastrophe, the moment when the cold, hard facts of suffering and death are suddenly and eternally reversed by something that reason couldn't have predicted. The fairy tale trains the imagination for this possibility, teaching us to expect that the end of the story isn't really the end. Against the determined realism of the disenchanted world, it keeps alive the possibility that the darkness is not the last word. So why do we miss worlds that never existed? We miss them because the worlds that do exist, the ones available in our ordinary disenchanted lives, are missing something, and we can feel it. Behind the glass screen of abstraction, we are safe from evil spirits and the cosmic significance of every thunderclap, but we are also insulated from the full human condition. We are protecting ourselves from the fear of the animate, of the aliveness that can only be found in relationship with a universe that cares. By protecting ourselves from the real, we can't be a part of it anymore. The loss is structural and complex, and the depth of the ache we feel is proportional to the power of the creature we're serving without being able to stop. Somewhere below the level of conscious articulation, we know we're swimming in waters we weren't made for, and it's becoming harder and harder to ignore. Fairy tales, myths, and fantasy worlds don't make up for this loss. They're testimony to what was lost, and the small ways we might find it again in our lives. In Miyazaki's Forest Spirits, Murakami's Liminal Thresholds, and Tolkien's Shire, we find images of where the secondary world bleeds into the primary, and for a moment the veil is lifted. We are shown what the disenchanted story has trained us not to see. The three artists build secondary worlds to restore the perception that the primary world is really magical, that matter is not all there is, and that reason and imagination aren't threats to each other. Their worlds show us the power of enchantment because it's how we notice what's really there. At the end of the discarded image, C.S. Lewis doesn't tell us that the medieval model was correct in its astronomy or its physics. He tells us that it was expressing something real about the human experience of a cosmos, and that what we lost when we replaced it was just as real. We lost the ability to participate in our world, to stand within it and let it hold us. I have made no serious effort, he writes, to hide the fact that the old model delights me as I believe it delighted our ancestors. Few constructions of the imagination seem to me to have combined splendour, sobriety, and coherence in the same degree. Splendour, sobriety, and coherence are the qualities that the secondary world, at its best, preserves and transmits. The worlds of Tolkien, Miyazaki, and Murakami offer these qualities to their audience as a hopeful reminder that the ache of nostalgia points to something true, that was lost but can be found. The imagination that built those worlds is the human collective, the same imagination that built the world we live in, and that it is still alive and still building. In part 2, we will follow that building into Middle-earth, and into the theological argument that Tolkien was making in The Lord of the Rings. His secondary world is ultimately grounded in the Christian story, and that's what gives it its enduring power. The story of Middle-earth has moved more people more deeply than any other work of modern fantasy, and when we understand why, it helps us see the veil of disenchantment for what it is. Because the reason that moves them is not the magic of the secondary world alone. It's the truth of the primary one, finally seen clearly.